In this chapter, we talk about when markets fail. In general, markets are a very, very good way to distribute goods and services, and they do it very efficiently, as we've discussed previously, and we'll discuss more in this chapter. But there are times the market does fail, and these are the two cases noted here: public goods and externalities. And my subtitle is when it doesn't work. In other words, when the market doesn't work. In the case of public goods, they will not produce those goods at all. We'll explain that. And with externalities, they don't do it efficiently, and we'll explain why a little bit later. Market failure in a competitive market can be due to three things. It can be due to too little competition, that's one. And that's an important one because up to now we have assumed there are lots of buyers and lots of sellers in the market. Well, what happens when there's only one seller in the market? Well, obviously you have too little competition. How many firms does it take to have enough competition? It's hard to say. It can take 2 or 3, it can take 2 or 3,000, or it can take 2 or 3 million to really make it competitive. It's going to depend a lot on how those firms respond. The second way that markets may failure is through the demand side failure. And what this means is that consumers, strangely enough, are not demanding enough of the product because they're not getting all the benefits of that product. We'll discuss that a little bit later too. And then the supply side failure, which is probably the one that most of us are going to be the most familiar with, is a failure when producers do not pay all of the costs of production. So that becomes a market failure too. So in this chapter, we're going to discuss those. We're going to discuss how markets do a very efficient job of producing and allocating goods and services, but when they fail, how that means that they don't do a good job anymore, and how we have to do it better, and then what kinds of policies would we institute to take care of these problems. Here's our model of efficient markets, and one of the things we use to do this with is something called consumer and producer surplus. Probably a real bugaboo for new students to economics. It may not make a lot of sense, but the more I study it, the more I find it to be very, very useful. Notice here we have a typical supply and demand curve. Demand curve downward sloping to the right, supply curves upward sloping to the left, and we have an equilibrium price we have shown. So I provided that with you in the above slide. Now we introduce the concept of consumer and producer surplus. As we discussed earlier, the consumer bases their purchase of a good on the fact that the good produces more benefits for them than they pay for it. Let us use gasoline as an example. Currently the price of gasoline is about $2 a gallon. Let's say it's worth $3 a gallon to you. This means you're getting benefits of $3 but only paying $2. That means you're getting $1 in benefits you're not paying for, and that's because everybody pays the same price in the marketplace. That's called a consumer surplus, and this is a good thing for you. And it really doesn't hurt the supplier either, by the way. Thus, the demand curve really measures the benefits consumers receive, and it's called a marginal benefit curve. Thus, we measure consumer surplus by the area above the price line and below the demand curve, and this is that triangular shaped area ABP. If you're not familiar with that type of notation, it doesn't make any difference how you designate that triangle as long as it's all in some kind of order. So it could be ABP or BPA or however you want to do it. Of course, the producer is receiving the price you're paying. For some producers, they would be willing to produce it at a lower price. This is shown by the supply curve. Later in the course, we'll discuss exactly how we get that supply curve, but the supply curve is actually a measure of marginal cost, or what it costs the producer to produce that particular unit. Thus, the difference between what it costs the producer to produce that unit and what it sells for, P, is called a producer surplus. So if you look anywhere on that supply curve at that one point, that is what that one unit is costing directly that producer to produce, and that's in reality what they would sell it for. But they don't need to because they'll sell it at market price P. And this is the area PBC, as we indicated, the area below the price line and above the supply curve. The two of these areas together, ABP and PBC, measures what we call total welfare. The greater that this area is, the greater the net benefits to society. In a competitive market system, this area is maximized, thus total welfare is maximized. It's important to understand that simply moving a dollar from producers to consumers does nothing. It does not increase welfare because this dollar is now taken from one of the resource providers. In other words, what's really happening is you're simply taking it from one person in the economy and giving it to somebody else. Politicians like to suggest that we're better off, but we're not. What happens if we move away from this competitive equilibrium? Then we reduce total welfare, as we see in the following slides. Now, let's go back to the issue of efficiency. Efficiency is a big thing in economics. We're very enthralled by it. We talk a lot about it, but the two we really talk about are productive and allocative efficiency. Productive efficiency is fairly easy to understand. It simply means we're going to produce that product at the lowest possible cost. Nobody really knows what the lowest possible cost is. They're only going to know it by competing. So because of easy entry, costs and prices are going to tend to be minimized. We've talked about profits previously and how when profits are too high, firms enter the market. Well, when they enter the market, they're probably coming in and doing it more cheaply, trying to undercut the existing firms. They're going to drop prices to try to take customers away from those groups. So what it tends to do, because of that easy entry, is drive prices as low as possible. Allocated efficiency means the cost of the last unit produced is exactly equal to the price. You have a downward sloping demand curve, and where the demand curve and the supply curve intersect, that very last person, exactly where that curve, those curves intersect, that last person's paying exactly what the amount equal to the price, and that's the benefit they get from it. Note, at equilibrium, the last person that will purchase a product is paying exactly what it costs to produce it, and this is what we mean by allocative efficiency. Everybody else is getting more benefits, but the very last person is getting just enough benefits to offset its cost. Now, let's assume the government decides that they don't like that price. They decide they're going to raise the price. Then the government comes along and establishes a price floor, and I've shown that in this graph: supply curve, demand curve, price above the equilibrium. I don't show the equilibrium price. You can see where that is. But you have it at price B, in other words, above equilibrium. Well, what's going to happen in this case? Well, in the above graph, we see a price floor, and the government set the price at P. This means instead of producing Q2 units, we're only producing Q1 units. The consumer surplus is now ABP, and the producer surplus is PBDE. In other words, ABP is the area below the demand curve and above the price line. But again, it's restricted by the fact that the government's decided what the price is. The producer is actually, for some of the units, getting a higher price than they would have, and so it's actually a four-sided figure where it was a triangular shaped area before. But note the area BCD. This is what we call a deadweight loss. It's gone. Since we have raised the price, some people have been priced out of the market, and they simply aren't going to buy those units, and even though they would receive more benefits than the cost of producing it. So this actually leads to greater inefficiency because of this deadweight loss. In other words, goodbye. I often talk about minimum wage as an example. If you raise minimum wage, there's going to be some loss to this. How great it is, we don't know, but we do know there's going to be some. For there not to be takes an extremely special case. Public goods. Well, one area where the market fails is in the case of public goods. Private goods have two characteristics. They're excludable and there is rivalry. What we mean by that is if you can't afford to buy the good, you don't get it. You're excluded from buying it. So you go down to the car dealer, you say, I want that car. He says it's $30,000, and you say, I don't have $30,000. He says, okay, you don't get the car. Well, what about rivalry? Well, if somebody else comes along and buys that car, then I can't buy it. So once they have it, can't get it, that's called rivalry. In the case of public goods, the good is non-excludable and there is no rivalry. In other words, once we produce it, everybody can consume it. And there is no rivalry because even if you get it, I can still get it too. These are very unique situations. And because of that, the market's not going to produce it. Why? Because once I sell it to one person, everybody else gets it free. So only one person is going to pay for it, and probably not even that. So there's no way I can even cover my costs. So that usually means the government is going to have to produce it, and that means they're probably going to have to tax us to pay for it. An example, probably the best example of a public good is national defense. Go to the example. Let's assume you have a National Defense Department. We're going to find National Defense is an organization that protects the borders of the country. And so we send everybody a bill every month saying, please send us $20 for your national defense fee. So some guy sitting in Iowa says, I'm not paying. So how do we take it away from them? Impossible. We can't. So since public goods will not be produced by the market, how do we determine demand? Well, it's kind of like anything else. What we have to do is determine how many units a consumer would buy at each price or tax. In other words, we're going to say, okay, if I charge you this much, how many would you want? Well, how about this? How many would you want, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That would determine demand. Now, assume we have a price of $20 and consumer A wants 4, consumer B wants 3, and consumer C wants 5. This means at $20, the number of units demanded of the good is 12. At a different tax, these numbers would change. So by doing that, we could develop a demand curve for public goods. We would then take that demand curve and weigh it against the supply curve and get an equilibrium. And so we could develop a demand supply for the public good. And the optimal level would be where these two intersect, and at that point the marginal cost of producing the public good equals the marginal benefit of the public good. Now, the reality is obtaining that information would be very, very, very difficult. And I'm not sure our system of obtaining it now is any better, because it simply becomes something for politicians to argue about, and I'm not sure they're doing a very efficient job. Also, you might say there are externalities created by producing the public good, which creates all kinds of problems later, and we will talk about that in the next chapter when we talk about government failure. Well, what about quasi-public goods? Well, some goods are actually produced both by the government and the private sector. They could all be produced in the private sector, but for some reason we've decided the government should produce some of them. Examples, probably my two favorite ones, are education and parks. For instance, Vanderveer Park, not too far from the university, is there for your use. You don't have to pay to get in, and is provided by the government. There are also private parks. Usually when I ask people to name a private park, they kind of go blank on me. Disneyland is a private park. Very fancy private park, much different than Vanderveer, but it's still a private park. In the case of Vanderveer, we don't charge you anything to get in, and the government has to pay for it. In the case of Disneyland, yeah, we charge you to get in, very hefty price, and you seem to be willing to pay for that. Both of these could be produced strictly in the private sector, but the government produces some of these and the private sector produces others. For instance, education, we have a combination of private and public schools. What about externalities? Well, another area where markets fail is where we have externalities. Externalities are defined as a cost or benefit accruing to a third party. And this definition will make a little bit more sense as we go through some examples. In a private sector, we assume the consumer receives all the benefits from purchasing a product and the supplier pays all the costs of producing the good. With externalities, that's not true. There are two types, positive and negative, as you might expect. Positive externalities exist when the consumer is not receiving all the benefits from the purchase of a good. In other words, somebody else is getting some of the benefits of the good he's purchasing. Well, the problem is he or she is not going to be willing to pay more than the benefits they receive. So that's going to be a problem. In fact, as we're going to see later, that probably means we have an under-allocation of resources to that area. And some of those benefits are accruing to a third party, as we've said. Negative externalities exist when suppliers do not pay all the costs of producing, but push those costs off on a third party, as we have defined. An example is pollution. And more specifically, let's use the example of smoking. Great example of an externality. Currently, we no longer allow people to smoke indoors in public areas. But let's assume we did, and somebody comes to class one night and they have a pack of cigarettes and they light up a cigarette in class. What would happen? Well, you wouldn't like it probably. Your eyes would water, you might sneeze, might just be uncomfortable. So what they've now done is they've imposed a cost on you. supplier's not paying it. Supplier just paid for growing tobacco and putting in a cigarette. Consumer of that good's not paying it either, right? So he's imposing a cost on you. Now, costs don't have to be direct costs. If you're just simply uncomfortable or don't like it, that's a cost. In the case of positive externalities, the good is being underproduced, and in the case of negative externalities, it's being overproduced. So we're going to show that with this graph right here. We're going to show this as a positive externality. So in this case, we have two demand curves, D1 and D2, and a supply curve. And you see you have quantities produced with each demand curve. Well, what we've got here is we've got D1, which really represents the individual's demand curve, which is simply the benefits they receive, and D2, which is going to include D1 plus the benefits that accrue that third party. And that's discussed in this slide. So we have that supply curve and the two demand curves. D1's demand, the consumer's demand curve. And assume we have a positive externality so that D2 shows the consumer's demand curve plus the externality. With D1, we are only producing Q1 units, but if we add the positive externality, then D2 is the real demand curve, D1 plus the externality. This means we are underproducing the good or over-allocating resources to production of that good. So we really should be producing more than we are if we're going to be efficient. Well, what about a negative externality? Well, this is shown in this graph with the downward sloping demand curve and supply curve 1 and 2. And with supply curve 1, we're producing Q1, and supply curve 2, we're producing Q2. And that is shown, that is discussed here. S1 is the producer's cost of producing the good, but the producer is creating an externality. This means the real cost is not S1, but S1 plus the externality. In other words, the cost they impose on other people. And that's S2. If we force the producer to pay or stop producing the externality, his cost will rise and his supply curve will now be S2. And that means at that point we're going to produce less. So if we move the curve to S2, the amount produced will fall from Q1 to Q2. This means with a negative externality, we're overproducing the good or over-allocating resources to production of the good. Well, what about some policies for positive externalities? Well, there are a few we can do to increase the demand for those, and some of them should be obvious. So what are they? Well, one way is to subsidize the consumer or pay them to purchase a good. We do this with education. We give you student aid, or we provide for it for you at a lower cost, and that's really the second one. So for instance, we, quote, provide free public education. Well, education's not free, we know that. Somebody has to pay for it, but we believe it's valuable enough, and we don't want people to have to pay a price they can't afford, because then in that case, they won't buy it at all. And a third way is to subsidize the supplier, and to some extent we do this too. Example would be higher education, where we provide assistance to private colleges to provide it. This will increase production of the good without increasing price to the consumer. Well, what about policies for negative externalities? Well, there are a few, and some of them a lot of environmentalists don't like because they look at them as somehow allowing people to pollute and just pay for it. And in a way they do, but they're also lead to greater efficiencies. First of all, you have to accept the fact that zero pollution is not possible, nor is it even it's not even a good idea. Number one, if we try to get to zero, the cost will be astronomical and with little to no benefit. As we know, some levels of pollution aren't going to hurt us at all. So over the years, since the 1970s, we have developed policies to combat pollution. Well, one of those is direct controls. We simply tell you you can't pollute. In fact, I used smoking a little bit ago as an example of pollution. So what we tell people is you can't smoke inside a public area. That's a command and control system. And so, they work, but the problem is they really don't take into account changing market conditions. So while they may work more in the near future, they may not be very efficient, nor may they work at all. For instance, in the case of pollution, we now have the e-cigarettes, which don't emit smoke. Well, they're talking about trying to regulate those. Question may be, do we really need to? Because they don't really emit any of the bad stuff that regular cigarettes do. The others, we can impose a tax, a specific tax. In other words, if you're emitting, say, sulfur dioxide, we're going to tax you for that. So we place a tax on the sulfur dioxide. What's going to happen, now many people say, well, that just means you're going to pay a tax and go on polluting. Not really. If it's cheaper to reduce the externality, they're going to reduce it. If it costs more than the tax, then they're not going to reduce it. But what that allows us to do is reduce the level of pollution by allowing the low-cost emitters to cut their pollution first. Now, you can also raise the tax. So if you're not getting the level you want, raise the tax some more, and you can reduce it some more. Another way we can do it is permits. Now, as I indicated, some level of pollution is acceptable, won't hurt you. In fact, may even be good for you. So each producer is provided with a permit to produce a certain amount. They can't produce any more than that, or they'll either pay a fee or they'll be forced to shut down. So it keeps it at a certain level. Above that level, maybe we will tax them. Maybe tax them heavily, for that matter. But they're given a certain free pass on a certain amount, and then they're going to have to pay for more or just simply shut down. What about trading? Well, let's go back to our permits. Let's say we all are given a permit to emit a certain amount of pollution. Let's say I'm allowed 20 tons a year, and I find out it's really easy for me to reduce it to 10 tons a year. What that means is I can trade or sell my permit for the additional 10 tons to somebody who's having a more difficult time reducing their pollution levels. This means this permit that I can sell now has value to me. And I might decide, if the value of that permit gets high enough, I can install pollution control devices and simply sell the permit to help pay for the pollution control devices. That means, again, that if it's cheaper for me to do it than the value of the permit, I'm going to do that. If it's more expensive for another group, they're not going to do that, but that means that we're getting the pollution to be reduced at the lowest possible cost, which is very important even with pollution. So the producer finds it the cheapest way to reduce pollution. We could also do a couple of things. We could pay a subsidy to the producer, which is a possibility. We could pay them to put on pollution control devices, or third, we could simply provide for pollution reduction. In Germany, they have a very strange situation. The factories there are actually allowed to dump toxic waste into the rivers, and then the government simply cleans it up. They find that to be a cheaper way than trying to control each of the factories. What about the optimal level of pollution reduction? Well, here we're going to show a couple of things. It's a little bit different in the supply and demand curve, because on the vertical axis you have marginal benefits of pollution control. Now notice what happens as the quantity of pollution goes down, then what's going to happen is our marginal benefits are going to get lower and lower. In other words, when we're at very low levels of pollution, we're not really going to find that much benefit from reducing it more. So, if you have very tiny amounts, nobody knows, it doesn't affect anybody, you're not going to put a very high value on that. Now, at very high levels, of course, then, we put a very high value on it because it may be making us sick, it could be destroying the paint on our house. Yeah, those are possibilities. The other one's the marginal cost to reduce it. So, as we reduce pollution more, the cost goes up. In fact, I've drawn this as a straight line, but in fact it would get very vertical when we get close to zero. So again, we've shown that in that above slide, and again, as pollution's reduced, the value of additional reduction goes down, and there's also, as the reduction, as we reduce it more, the cost goes up. So it gets to be more and more expensive. For instance, when we first started requiring pollution control devices on cars, reducing the initial amounts of pollution were actually very simple and very costly. If you tuned up your car, you'd probably reduce a lot of it. Eventually, as we required more and more reductions, we found it got to be more and more costly. Over time, though, the technology got better and actually improved the operation of the car. So we probably went through the 70s making some really, really bad cars because we hadn't developed good technology yet. Again, though, going back to the optimal level of pollution reduction, a zero level of pollution is not possible nor necessary, and may not even be a good idea at all. The intersection of the two curves at Q is the optimal amount of pollution reduction because the marginal cost of reducing it equals the marginal benefit of